Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Report. I'm Art Fennell. The recent shooting at Los Angeles International Airport, which left one TSA agent dead and 2 others wounded, highlights an ongoing problem concerning our safety. In fact, it's a matter that has prompted national security officials to meet with their departments to talk about it. The question is simple: how do we make our airport safer? Now, you might think this would be an easy fix, right? Just add more patrol officers. Not necessarily so. Security experts tell us that that's easier said than done. Airports are so large and so spread out that moving more officers to one section of an airport just leaves another area possibly more vulnerable. Just 2 days after the LAX shooting, there was another airport scare, this one in Birmingham, Alabama. Correspondent Shelby Lynn starts our coverage.
Operations at Alabama's Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport are back to normal. But Sunday afternoon, authorities evacuated the airport over a bomb threat. Police say someone found a note containing the threat in a bathroom, prompting the evacuation. It caused a cancellation or delay of a dozen flights. Birmingham Police Sergeant Johnny Williams says a search of the airport turned up nothing.
Big inconvenience to everyone involved, those passengers, those visitors, our officers, the airport employees.
It may have been a big inconvenience in Birmingham, but the incident comes just 2 days after a gunman opened fire at LAX, killing a TSA agent and wounding 3 other people. Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Congressman Mike McCall, acknowledges travelers are vulnerable in certain areas of the airport, like areas outside security checkpoints.
It's very difficult to stop these types of attacks. Anybody can show up, as we saw in the Navy Yard, with a shotgun, in this case with a semi-automatic. And, it's like a shopping mall outside the perimeter. It's almost like an open shopping mall. So it's very difficult to protect.
Meanwhile, new details are emerging about the alleged gunman. Authorities went to do a welfare check at the request of Paul Ciancia's family and missed him by just 45 minutes. Shelby Lynn, Atlanta.
Erik Miller is an expert on security intelligence and terrorism. He's president of WarningStar Intelligence, a security and intelligence firm. Prior to that, he worked at the Institute of Terrorism Research and Response. Mr. Miller, thanks for being here. We do appreciate it. You know, we're seeing these reports and hearing expert officials tell us that this is not an easy fix. It seems simple enough. In these days and times, how can a gunman just walk into an airport and start shooting?
Well, it's a good question, and I think what we have to understand about airports is that there's 2 different types of areas. There's a non-secure section, which is the public section, which is as we drive up to the airport from the curb to the checkpoint. But beyond the checkpoint, that's called the secure area or the sterile area. And so what I would say is that the sterile area is relatively safe. In fact, it's very safe. But the problem is the non-secure area when you first enter into the airport building. Well, there's no metal detectors at the entrance. There's no profiling as you drive up. They do have a policy now where you can't leave your car outside the front door. You can drop people off, but you got to quickly go and take your vehicle into the parking lot. So the bottom line is that this can happen because we allow it. We allow a certain amount of freedom in the public area.
I want to talk about that cost of freedom in just a moment, but let's go back to this perimeter for just a moment here. Right after 9/11, we know that there were security screenings on the outside. As you drove up, there were dogs. They were checking underneath your car and so forth. There was a show of force as you're driving up to an airport to drop off a passenger or whatever. Obviously, you can't linger there. But that was checking for bombs necessarily in the car or around the car. Would that type of presence, again, stop someone who had a gun on them from walking inside?
I think that it probably would, but the problem is that under the current circumstances with budget cuts, I think an operation like that at every major airport in the country would be a tremendous expense. And I'm not saying that it's not worth the expense, but I think that the American people would have a problem paying higher taxes or whatever it would take to implement those kind of security measures. There's also the privacy issue. So it's a cost issue, but it's also Americans don't like their freedoms to be restricted.
Yeah. You mentioned the cost factor here. Officers are being cut back in a lot of airports around the country because to maintain that kind of show of force all the time, let's say that 99% of the time, there's no reason to have officers at a door and nothing ever happens there. It's that 1% when someone does come through, that's the issue. And then there's the issue of trying to move officers. Let's say that you've already got an adequate force, but you're going to move them from the TSA checkpoint area.
Right.
You're going to move them now to the check-in area when you first walk into the building.
Yeah.
But then doesn't that leave another area potentially vulnerable by shifting people around?
Sure. And again, I think it comes down to a manpower issue. When you have limited funds to hire law enforcement in the public section, they're going to have to move their men around because, I mean, I don't know exactly why the police were moving in the LAX incident, but I could guess that it was probably to change up their routine, to avoid any kind of surveillance or counter-surveillance from adversaries.
Yeah.
So.
And LAX is a major airport. Been there a gazillion times. You look at major airport hubs, it seems that you're going to obviously have more people, more security officials. But then there are secondary airports, there are smaller airports in smaller cities and so forth, where obviously there's less security personnel. Is it even possible to begin to think about trying to adequately secure every airport in the country?
Well, again, I think it comes down to money. So if we're willing to pay for it, we can do it, at least to the best of our abilities. But I just don't think it's a realistic possibility that we're going to spend that, especially in the current economic situation. So the answer to your question, according to me, is no. We can't protect airports 100%. Just like we can't protect libraries or post offices.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's the next thing. They're saying that airports may just be one of the areas here. I want to read a quote from a security official who was quoted as saying why that wouldn't work. And this is what this one security official says. He's going on to say here that a terrorist bomber can then drive 3 blocks further to another crowded place that's not necessarily secure. So you leave the airport because you see security out there. They drive to another airport, another place, another airport or a train station, a bus depot, a supermarket, a theater. We saw that in Aurora, California, a schoolyard. So if they're looking to wreak havoc, they can go somewhere else.
Correct. So the nature of the situation is that we can't have 100% protection on all assets. What we have to do, I think, I come at it from an intelligence point of view. So I believe that we need to have an intelligence-led risk management strategy and allow the intelligence to get ahead of the problem and try to detect where the most likely threats are. And then we can direct law enforcement and our security forces in that direction.
How do you do that?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on the threat itself. If we're dealing with a domestic or a lone wolf situation, sort of what we saw at LAX recently, it's not an organized act of terror, so it's much harder to detect. But in this case with the shooter, he did make a text message. He sent a text message to his family in New Jersey, and his family informed police officers, and that is a form of intelligence that if it had just moved faster, we could have stopped the shooting.
Well, 2 issues there that you brought up. One is this lone wolf mentality. If you think about the major shootings that we've had in this country and perhaps around the world, with the exception of perhaps in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Egypt, where we've seen, mass gunmen.
Right.
But it's usually one person. It's usually an American. This is not a foreign threat. This is not Al-Qaeda.
Right.
These are people who grew up in our neighborhoods and went to our schools, like in the case of Paul Ciancia, Pennsville, New Jersey, the LAX shooter. But then go back to the Aurora, California shooting. Look at all the school shootings, the mall shootings, the Navy Yard. In Washington, D.C.
The movie theater in Aurora.
On and on and on. Yeah. These are people that we know. So they don't look suspicious. They're not walking around, if they walked into an airport, they don't look any different from anybody else, not acting any different from anybody else. how in the world would they send up a red flag?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that they don't act differently, because if you're a trained behavior detection specialist, security officer for TSA, you should be picking up on subtle body language indicators. Probably that this guy who shot up LAX recently was giving off, Paul Ciancia. But for the normal Joe, like you and I, who aren't trained in that kind of thing, it would be hard for us to detect that. But I think that we need to train our profilers to.
And I'm putting a lot of tough questions on you here, but how in the world can a trained person even, in a crowded area where there is so many people, there's so many people at an airport, at a supermarket, we haven't even talked about sporting events, anywhere where there's a lot of people, is it even possible to keep an eyeball on everybody to say, that person's acting a little strange, that person's acting a little strange, and then to actually go and concentrate on that person?
It is difficult, but it's possible. I'll give you an example real quick. One of the experts on my team in WarningStar is a former Sky Marshal from U.S. Customs. And there's a story where he and my father went to Philly Airport one day, and they were checking out passengers. And my friend picked out the guy in line, thought he was looking suspicious, and he pulled him over. He said, "Take off your boots." And the passenger took off his cowboy boots, and hashish fell out. Now the question is, how could he detect that? And the answer is that he was giving off nonverbal clues, such as his eyes were darting around, or his eyes were down, he wasn't looking directly at security personnel. He wasn't just having a casual conversation with another person like most normal people do. So yes, I do believe there's a science to this.
Can they, the risk of being wrong and the lawsuit potentially to follow. Let's say that they pull over a person and say, "Hey, take off your shoes. Let's see what you got here." And there was nothing. And the person says, "Why was I profiled? Why'd you pull me out of that line? I didn't do anything wrong. You know, what is this? You know, you guys are trying to get me." You know, we know how that continues to go.
Sure.
The bottom line is, Ms. Miller, we don't like to be inconvenienced.
Right.
You know, we take off our shoes during the TSA checkpoint and so forth, and we put all of our small items in the plastic bag so they can see them. But when you're busy, we're a culture that's on the go, on the run. We're moving fast. We're always late, and we don't want to be stopped and hassled because someone thinks that we don't look right that day.
Right. But I think
I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's the culture we're in.
Sure. No, I agree. But I think that we also live in a culture that's post 9/11, where 3,000 Americans were killed because of lax security policies in airports. So I think, you know, we have to sort of conform a little bit to some sort of screening if we want to fly and feel secure as we do.
Okay. All right. We're going to talk about next steps in this because, again, as I said, security officials are talking about this. This matter is coming back now to the forefront, whereas it was starting to become a little bit more relaxed, I think, but it's coming back to the forefront now. And we're going to talk about some next step possibilities. I'm going to get your thoughts on that as well, so stick around. You're watching Art Fennell Reports. We're talking about how secure are we really? How safe do you feel? We'll be back with more after this.
What I'm more concerned about right now is a predictable response. You know, right after I was on the Virginia Tech panel, and right after the Virginia Tech tragedy, people thought, well, maybe we should arm students, and then we have the schoolroom tragedies, and now they want to arm teachers, and now there's conversations about arming the TSA. We don't need to arm America. We don't need to arm the unarmed. We really need to figure out why so many people go to violence to solve their problems or to express their grievances.
That's former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge, former governor of Pennsylvania as well, saying that we don't need to arm America. So we're asking the question, how safe are we really? This is all in the wake of the LAX shooting and other shootings that we've experienced around the country. My guest speaking about this is Erik Miller, expert on security, intelligence, and terrorism, also the president of WarningStar Intelligence and Security, which is an intelligence firm. And prior to that, he worked on the Institute of Terrorism Research and Response. So you've got a great deal of experience in this. You just heard former Secretary Ridge say that, look, we can't arm the teachers, can't arm all the teachers. We can't arm the students. We can't arm everybody everywhere. We got to find another way around this. You say what to that?
I agree. I don't think we can operate on a policy where we just react to every shooting by arming local law enforcement, local security guards. In this case, TSA. I think the problem with arming TSA agents is that they don't have the law enforcement training that would require, skills of
a police officer.
All right.
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to keep you right there then.
Yeah.
Why not then transfer police officers and make them TSA, or maybe you don't arm all of the TSA agents, but you take some of them and give them special training so that they are armed and they're in those checkpoints.
I think to be fair to the TSA union boss who suggested this idea, he wasn't saying let's arm all 50,000 TSA security officers. What he was saying was let's create sort of an elite cadre of armed, basically what you said, law enforcement TSA.
Yeah.
I think that's a possibility, but I'd like to bring the focus back on the fact that there's two jurisdictions at an airport. You have, again, the secure area, which is the TSA's jurisdiction, and they're unarmed. But in the public section, you have local or regional law enforcement officers. So in Philadelphia, for instance, it's the Philadelphia Police Department. They have jurisdiction in that section. So I would say if we want, yes, let's increase armed law enforcement officers, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can just hire more or train more police officers, and especially to guard the checkpoints so that if another TSA agent is targeted, at least I think there should always be an armed law enforcement officer at every checkpoint.
Yeah, I've traveled extensively around the world, and I'm sure you have as well. You go to foreign airports in some places, as soon as you step near the airport, I mean, there is a guy with a big weapon standing right there, and you really feel intimidated, and it can be a bit imposing. But isn't that the idea? That there is such a strong show of force, and they're not carrying handguns. They're carrying automatic weapons and machine guns and everything. You think about it.
Yeah.
But that's a strong show of support. Is that too much for us here in America?
Probably. I don't think Americans would go for it right now unless there was another 9/11. But I think we can increase deterrence. And, take the Secret Service. These guys will wear wires in their ears, and they're out there, and they know they're being seen. They know that they can be seen by the public, and they do that purposely because they want to show a deterrent effect. That if you mess with our president or whoever we're protecting, you're either going to be captured or you're going to be killed.
Yeah, one or the other.
And I think that we could definitely flood these public sections of the airport with more officers.
All right, I want to keep expanding out of the airport just for a minute here. Let's take our schools, and there've been plenty of school shootings, and we see this all the time. There was a big deal mentioned in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm just singling out Atlanta in one case, where they got some federal money in for the school system, and they took that money and put it in security checkpoints as you enter into the building, not by buying more computers for learning. They put that money into security checkpoints when you walk in so that there are metal detectors and so forth. Some people said, oh, come on, that's just way over the top. That's something we don't need. Do we need more metal detectors before you walk into the airport, before you walk into a school, before you go to a sporting event? We haven't talked about that, going to a pro basketball game, college basketball game, football game. They're doing it in Philadelphia now, but not everywhere.
Yeah, I think, again, it's that kind of level of security is just not compatible with our American way of life right now. Hopefully it won't change in the future, because if it does change, that means we need it.
Yeah.
And, this is not Israel where we need it. I remember my last trip in Israel, I went to a shopping mall, and as we drove into the underground parking lot, security guard armed stopped us, checked our trunk, checked the bag, asked us why we were coming there.
How'd you feel about that?
I was okay with it. I mean, I accept it because, just like Israelis would accept it, because there's a constant threat of suicide bombings in that country. We don't have that threat here. And until we do, I don't think we should give up our freedoms so quickly.
Yeah, you're right. Suicide bombers that's a different level. Even if you go back to the Boston bombing, those guys weren't prepared to be suicide bombers. They took those bombs off and placed them.
Sure.
It's not like they just walked into the crowd and detonated. That's a different level, and obviously that's an instantaneous thing that's harder to control. There's thought being put into this. I think they're saying that it could be a ways off. I just want to get your input on it. A faster check-in system at airports so that crowds don't have to linger. The checkpoint, you're snaking around and waiting, then take your shoes off, put your stuff in the tray and go forward and so on. They're talking about maybe where you come through, you put your bag, your carry-on bag on a fast-moving conveyor belt, and that's gone. And then you move through a different area where you can come through faster, where they've got better technology that screens you top to bottom faster so that those crowds are moving.
Right.
They're not lingering and standing around and potentially vulnerable.
Yeah.
Do you see that as something that could possibly help?
Sure. I mean, one of the big problems at airports is the tension that builds up as you wait in line. And there's a lot of assaults against TSA agents just from regular passengers because of this. So I think that we have to build technologies that will allow, I think the way it's headed is technology that will allow you just to walk through a checkpoint and not have to go through all these bags and shoes and all these different components, but just a one check. The other thing is I'm a big believer in the vetting process. So you see the TSA developing this secure flight program.
Right.
And that's important because when we have a list of trusted passengers, TSA can shift their attention away from the majority of people who are innocent and normal, and really better focus or better identify those miscellaneous threats.
Now, mental illness and lack of a criminal record. Those are two things that have become synonymous now because a lot of the shooters that we've seen, they've had some type of mental illness or deep depression, in the case of Paul Ciancia, in the case of others who have been mentally disturbed. And they don't have a record. It's not like, this guy's got a rap sheet a mile long, or this person failed a criminal background check.
Right.
They're going to pass a criminal background check. So again, they're not going to stand out as being someone that can't be on a secure flight list.
No, you're right. But I think that a common denominator in all those mental illness-inspired shootings is that usually there's somebody who's close to the perpetrator, whether it's a mother, a father, a psychiatrist, that sees warning signs. And I think the key to this is that we have to formalize some kind of reporting system where these warning signs are reported to law enforcement officers so that there can be checks on these people before they take that step beyond no return.
Yeah, that's another level. As you say, to get people in the mindset of reporting their friends.
Yeah, if you see something,
like,
say
hey,
something.
Eric, I saw Eric. He didn't seem so right to me. I'm gonna report him.
Yeah, and this shouldn't be sort of like a big brother type of thing, but it should just be a look. I mean, if you see warning signs, if you see somebody saying they want to hurt themselves, there's a good chance that if they do that, they could hurt somebody else in the process. So I think it's legitimate.
They usually do.
Yeah. So in this case, in the LAX shooting, you had text messages. In the Aurora, shooting, and you had conversations with the therapist that would have, made a lot of sense for law enforcement to know. So, I think we have to think. There's no system in place right now, but we have to think about how to address mental illness in this country.
Yeah. The bottom line here is that mental illness or whatever the potential threat is and why it's there for whatever reason, because a lot of these cases in America aren't necessarily politically motivated or religion motivated as you see in foreign countries. But I guess we're just saying that overall we're just going to have to try and cope better because you can't arm everybody, and you can't make it a fail-safe system.
Well, I'd like to say something. I think that even though that the shooter, the recent LAX shooting, was probably mentally ill, I also believe that he had an ideology behind his act. And we know that because the note that he had with him talked about traitorous TSA agents.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for sharing your insight on this.